Imagine waking up at 2:30 in the morning. It is pitch black. You are in your own bed, ostensibly safe, lying right next to the person you've been married to for 26 years. The house is completely quiet. The kids are asleep upstairs. And then out of that silence, you hear a whisper, 5 words. I just can't quit you. And instantly, viscerally, those words were not meant for you.
Right, and from a narrative perspective, that is the classic inciting incident. It's the event that disrupts the status quo so violently that the protagonist can literally never return to the way things were. It completely splits time into a before and an after.
Exactly. And this is July 11th, 2020. The person waking up in this scenario is Jen Hatmaker. Now, for those of you who might not be, deep in the weeds of American Christian subculture, Jen is a very big deal. She's a New York Times bestselling author, a massive speaker, a huge figure in the evangelical women's space, or, well, at least she was.
Yeah, she had built her entire career on being relatable, funny, and just deeply grounded in faith and family.
Right. But in this specific moment, she isn't any of those public figures.
Yeah.
She is simply a woman whose husband is voice texting her girlfriend while lying right next to his wife. And the physical reaction she describes in our source material, which is her memoir, Awake, it's terrifyingly real. She talks about being frozen, about floating above herself, just watching the world unravel in real time.
Which is a textbook trauma response. What she's describing there is dissociation.
Yeah.
When reality becomes too threatening or just too overwhelming for the brain to process cognitively, the nervous system engages a freeze response. You detach. You view yourself from the third person because inhabiting the first person is simply too dangerous in that split second.
And what follows that moment isn't just an emotional realization, it's a forensic one. She gets up, goes to the computer, and discovers what she calls a trail of betrayal. It wasn't just a stray text, it was an entire secret life. We're talking money, lies, infidelity, an entire architecture of deception built right under the roof of what she thought was a stable marriage.
Which brings us to the core of what we are going to explore today. We are doing a deep dive into Awake, a memoir by Jen Hatmaker. But I want to be very clear about our mission here.
Yes, please do, because this is important.
If you are approaching this looking for a tabloid spill-all, or just wanting the tea about a famous divorce, you're going to miss the actual value of the text. The divorce is really just the catalyst.
Right. This isn't a divorce book. The divorce is the explosion. But the material we're looking at is about the wreckage and the rebuild.
Precisely. The subject of our deep dive is the dissection of a human life. It's an examination of what happens when the simple rules you were handed as a child, rules about religion, about marriage, about being a so-called good girl, completely fail you. We have sources here ranging from memoirs to essays that cover everything from the psychological conditioning of 1990s purity culture all the way to the sociological impact of the 2020 pandemic.
It's a heavy stack of material, but it is deeply fascinating. We're going to explore a key theme today that I honestly think applies to everyone listening, whether you're religious or not, married or not. And that's the difference between the story of a life and the actual life. Because Jen Hatmaker had a phenomenal story. Perfect ministry, perfect family, perfect theology. But the actual life, that was a whole different animal.
And that gap, the distance between the story we perform and the truth we actually live, is where the suffering lives. But as we'll see today, it's also where the awakening happens.
So let's unpack this. To really understand the collapse, we have to understand the foundation. We have to go back to the before. This section in our source material is what I call the architecture of the good girl. And for Jen, and honestly for a lot of women who grew up in that specific evangelical culture, this architecture was incredibly rigid.
It is rigid. And it's not just rigid in a behavioral sense, it's rigid in a neurological sense. It creates a very specific theology of the body that rewires how a person perceives their own worth. There's this vivid, almost painful anecdote in the source material called The Dead Rose.
Oh man, this one. I read this and I physically recoiled. So for everyone listening, picture this. It's a church youth group in the 1990s. The student pastor stands up in front of a room full of teenagers. He's holding a beautiful, fresh red rose. And he tells the girls, "You are like this rose. A gift."
Let's just pause on that language for a second. A gift. Implicit in that statement is that you are not the recipient of your own life. You are the object to be given. You are a commodity.
Exactly. So he's holding this rose, and then he starts plucking the petals off one by one. He says, if you let a boy touch you, pluck. If you hold hands, pluck. If you have sexual thoughts, pluck. He keeps going until he's just holding this barren, thorny stick. And he tells these young girls, who would want this? Who would want to marry a ruined stick?
It's a horrific visual. But beyond the sheer cruelty of it, we need to look at the psychological mechanism at play here. This is what psychologists call internalized objectification. The message being encoded into these young minds is that a girl's value is finite and subtractive.
Subtractive, meaning you start at 100% and you can only go down.
Right. You start whole, and every experience, every mistake, every moment of autonomy subtracts from your value. Once ruined, there is no coming back.
Jen talks about how this set the stage for a lifetime of shame. She points out that she hadn't even done anything yet. She was just sitting there in a chair, but she writes about feeling wildly embarrassed. She was hyper-aware of her shirt being too tight, wondering if she was already ruined just by existing in a female body.
That's the true insidiousness of it. It creates what neuroscientist Antonio Damasio calls a somatic marker. A somatic marker is a feeling in the body that gets associated with a specific behavior or thought. So if you are taught that your sexuality is ruined or dangerous, your brain literally attaches a feeling of nausea or shame to any natural sexual impulse.
So it's not just a bad memory from youth group. It's actually rewriting how her nervous system reacts to herself.
Correct. It creates a profound disconnect between a woman and her own intuition. If you are taught, as Jen was, based on the Jeremiah 17.9 teaching that the heart is deceitful above all things, then you are explicitly trained not to trust your gut.
Wow.
Yeah, if your body signals danger or desire, you are trained to ignore it because your flesh is inherently wrong.
That explains so much about what happens decades later in her story. If you spent 30 years basically gaslighting yourself because you think your own intuition is sinful, of course you miss the red flags in a marriage. You've systematically trained yourself to ignore the smoke alarm.
Exactly. You don't have the tools to recognize the threat because you've identified yourself as the threat.
Which leads right into what the sources call the rush to adulthood. Because if you can't trust your body, and the only way to have sanctioned intimacy is within marriage, you rush the altar. Jen shares this story about sitting at her parents' kitchen table at 19 years old. 19. And she's explaining to them how she and her boyfriend can live on $800 a month.
$800 a month, and they're completely serious about it. They are engaging in what developmental psychologists call identity foreclosure.
Break that down for us. What exactly is identity foreclosure?
It's when a young person commits to an identity, a career, a marriage, a political or religious worldview before they have adequately explored their options. They skip the exploration phase of adolescence and jump straight to the commitment phase.
So in this context, they bypass the whole finding yourself phase of young adulthood to become ministry partners.
Yes. In that culture, you aren't two whole, developed people coming together to share a life. You are two halves forming a unit for a specific purpose, which is usually ministry. And that creates a highly precarious identity.
Because if the marriage fails, you don't just lose a partner.
Right. You lose the scaffolding of your entire adulthood. You lose the only adult self you've ever actually known.
She calls it the budget story. It's kind of funny in hindsight, but also deeply tragic. They had this godly-ish order to follow. They wanted to have sex, or as she puts it in the book, shag with impunity, so they had to get married. There was no backpacking through Europe, no dating around to see what kind of person you actually mesh with.
And it wasn't just hard on the women. This is where our deep dive gets really nuanced. And it's worth noting that Jen doesn't just paint her ex-husband as a one-dimensional villain here. She spends a lot of time examining the boy template.
Yes, we talk a lot about how patriarchy hurts women, obviously, but she really reflects on what this pressure did to him.
It's a crucial point of empathy in the sources. The boy template in evangelical circles is just as rigid as the good girl template. You have to be the spiritual leader. You have to be the alpha. You have to have all the answers, and you have to be the sole provider.
She describes the guys on her college campus who fit this mold. They were the superstars. They were leading Bible studies, playing acoustic guitar, oozing confidence. And her husband was trying so incredibly hard to fit that exact mold.
But we have to consider the psychological cost of that performance. We're talking about normative male alexithymia.
Okay, that is a $10 word right there, alexithymia. What does that mean in plain English?
Alexithymia simply means the inability to recognize or describe one's own emotions. Normative male alexithymia refers to the way boys are socialized, especially in conservative patriarchal environments, to completely cut off their connection to vulnerability. Pain is seen as weakness. Sadness is seen as a lack of faith. So if you are struggling, you literally cannot speak it.
So Jen speculates in the text that this template contributed heavily to his eventual disintegration. He couldn't say, I'm not fine. He couldn't say, I'm drowning.
Because the template doesn't allow for a drowning leader. If you admit you're drowning, you lose your status as the spiritual head of the household. So instead of seeking help, he sought escape. He sought a release valve for that immense pressure, which eventually manifested as the secret life.
Which brings us right into the middle of the story, the unraveling. Because you can only hold up that good girl and alpha male facade for so long before the cracks start to show. And this is where Jen introduces this concept of hidden corners.
This is such a powerful metaphor for denial. She makes a sharp distinction between the whole truth and hidden corners. The whole truth is terrifying because it disrupts the status quo. But hidden corners, those are where you tuck away the debt, the drinking, the doubts, the profound unhappiness.
I have to stop you there for a second, though, because frankly, when I first read about hidden corners, it sounded a lot like just normal privacy. Everyone has secrets. Everyone has parts of themselves they don't broadcast to the world or put on Instagram. Is the source material really saying that having private struggles is pathological?
That's a very important distinction to make. It becomes pathological when the hidden corner contradicts the public architecture of your life. It's not about privacy at all, it's about compartmentalization.
Meaning what exactly?
Privacy is simply, I don't share everything with everyone. Compartmentalization is, I am actively maintaining two opposing realities. She wasn't hiding a surprise birthday party. She was hiding the fact that the foundation of the house was rotting, all while inviting people over for dinner and telling them how sturdy the house was.
And she admits in the memoir that she loved the hidden corners. She says she didn't actually want the truth. She wanted the story of the marriage. She wanted the narrative of the high school sweethearts who beat the odds and made it.
That preference for the story over the truth is a form of survival, certainly, but it's also a classic form of codependency. One of the pivotal moments in the sources is when she reads Melody Beattie's seminal book, Codependent No More.
Oh, she hated that book at first. And honestly, I think a lot of people do when they first encounter it. We tend to think of codependency as meaning clingy or needy, like, oh, I just love him so much I can't bear to be without him.
Right, but that's not the clinical definition of codependency at all. Codependency is actually about control. It's an addiction to managing another person's behavior and mitigating their consequences.
That was the massive light bulb moment for her. She reads the definition and realizes it's about trying to control outcomes. It's about managing his moods just to keep the peace in the house.
She realized she wasn't just a passive victim of her husband's struggles. She was an active participant in the dynamic. She describes softening his blows to the kids. She talks about pretending it was a sunny day when a literal hurricane was blowing through the living room.
That image of the hurricane is so vivid in the book. She basically says she was making sandwiches while the house was being destroyed. Like, here, kids, have some peanut butter. Just ignore the roof flying off into the yard.
And the deep insight there is realizing that helping in that context isn't actually helping. It's enabling. It prevents the other person from feeling the natural consequences of their actions. She writes about the fallacy of trying to save a drowning person who is actively slashing their own life jacket with a knife. You can't save them. All you can do is drown right alongside them.
But the unraveling wasn't just personal. It was professional and spiritual, too. And interestingly, the career crisis happened before the marriage actually ended. This was back in 2016.
The timeline is very important to understand here. She was already in a state of profound cognitive dissonance regarding her faith community well before the divorce. The source material points to the 2016 election and the police shootings of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling as major catalysts for her.
Right, and to be clear to our listeners, we are entirely neutral on the politics here.
Right.
We are strictly reporting on the contents of the sources and how these events impacted her trajectory. The texts show her moving from a simple worldview, which is based on very black and white rules, to a complex one that began to acknowledge systemic racism and poverty.
And that shifted her theology entirely. She realized that in her specific community, truth often just meant doctrine that benefits the in-group. But when she started speaking out against racism, or when she publicly affirmed the LGBTQ community, she famously said in an interview that she would drink champagne at a gay wedding. The backlash from her world was immediate and severe.
This is where we see the sociological mechanism of in-group and out-group dynamics.
Right, exactly. In tight-knit, insular religious communities, belonging is highly conditional on adherence to the group's norms. When she violated those norms, by affirming gay marriage, for example, she suffered what sociologists refer to as social death.
It was brutal. Her books were pulled from store shelves. She received literal death threats. She lost a huge chunk of her community overnight. But she looks back on this and says it was a practice round.
It was a practice round for profound loss. She learned the fundamental difference between being right, meaning having the correct sanction doctrine, and being true, which means living with integrity. She realized she had been prioritizing belonging over her own integrity. The fallout from 2016 toughened her up for what was coming in 2020. She learned, essentially, that she could survive being cast out.
So fast forward to 2020. The marriage collapses, the hidden corners are completely exposed, and now we have to shift and talk about the body. Because you can't simply think your way out of this kind of compounded trauma.
No, you cannot. As Dr. Bessel van der Kolk famously wrote, the body keeps the score. We see this vividly illustrated in the story about Dr. Amati.
This scene in the book is terrifying. She's at an urgent care clinic. She hasn't slept in days. They take her vitals, and her blood pressure is 175 over 125. For context, for anyone who doesn't track blood pressure, that is hypertensive crisis territory. She isn't just sad. She is physically failing.
That is the direct result of what we call allostatic load.
Allostatic load. Can you explain that?
It's the cumulative wear and tear on the biological systems that results from chronic stress. Her body had been flooded with cortisol and adrenaline for months, maybe even years, constantly managing the hidden corners and the cognitive dissonance. Finally, the dam just broke.
And the doctor, Dr. Amati, doesn't just treat the symptoms. He speaks directly to the cause. He looks at her and tells her, your body has done so much. It worked overtime on adrenaline. Now it is time to help your body back.
It connects right back to that dead rose idea from the beginning, doesn't it? For her entire life, she was explicitly taught to ignore her body, to distrust it, to treat it as an enemy of her faith. And now her body is screaming so loud she physically cannot ignore it anymore. It's finally claiming its space.
It's almost like the body is the ultimate whistleblower. The mind can rationalize the lies to keep the story intact, but the blood pressure monitor can't.
Precisely. The body knew the truth long before the mind was willing to accept it. She references moments earlier in her life, like feeling deeply uncomfortable around a certain male teacher, or feeling physically sick when things were off in the marriage, where her body was sending very clear signals that she was trained to suppress. Now, in the midst of the crisis, she has to learn to listen. She has to learn that her body is an ally, not an enemy.
There's this great metaphor she uses during the healing process called the gurney. She has this moment during the pandemic where she sees a gay couple get married at her church virtually, and she feels this immense rush of hope. She texts her pastor, Jason, and says, "Put me in, coach. I'm ready to preach."
Manic optimism. It's a very common defense mechanism against grief. You want to skip the messy middle and get straight to the triumphant redemption arc. You want to be the success story before you've actually done the grueling work of healing.
But then Monday hits, and she completely crashes. She texts Jason back like, "Never mind, I am an absolute mess." And Jason sends this text back that I think everyone listening needs to hear if they're going through something hard. He says, "You're still on the gurney."
It's a profound permission slip. He tells her not to tug on the spring shoots. Healing requires waiting. It's a biological process, not just a psychological one. You can't force a plant to grow faster by pulling on its leaves, and you can't force a shattered nervous system to regulate just by willing it to.
But waiting is incredibly hard, especially for someone like Jen, who is a natural doer and a leader. She talks about her therapy sessions where she just wants to know how to stop being afraid. She literally asks for the checklist to fix the fear.
And her therapist gives her the exact opposite of a checklist. She teaches her about resistance versus acceptance. This is a core concept in dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT. Jen's instinct, like many of ours, was to fight the fear, to argue with it, to logic it away, to build a wall against it. The therapist tells her to go soft, to deliberately unclench her hands, to breathe, to let the wave of fear pass through her rather than building a dam against it.
It sounds so simple when you say it out loud, but it's so counterintuitive in practice. Going soft in the face of absolute terror. My instinct is to armor up and fight back.
Of course it is. That's the mammalian survival instinct. But psychological resistance creates physical tension, and tension locks the trauma in the body. It actually prolongs the suffering. Acceptance, which simply means acknowledging I'm scared right now, and that makes complete sense given my situation, allows the emotion to move through the nervous system and eventually subside. It's about riding the wave instead of trying to stop the ocean. Emotions are like tunnels. You have to go all the way through them to get to the light. You can't go around them.
While she's doing all this intense internal work, she's also being held up by her community. We absolutely have to talk about the village, because the way her friends showed up in these sources is, honestly, it's the gold standard for friendship.
It really is. And notice, it wasn't about grand, dramatic gestures. It wasn't about flying her to Paris to forget her troubles. It was about instrumental support.
Is that the clinical term for it?
Yes. In psychology, we distinguish between emotional support, which is listening, providing empathy, and instrumental support, which is tangible, practical help. The Starbucks ministry is a perfect example of instrumental support.
This was her friend Susan, who sent a $25 Starbucks gift card every single Monday for 6 months straight.
Every Monday. That's the key variable. It wasn't about the coffee itself. It was the signal that said, I haven't forgotten you. I know you're still in the trenches. When a major crisis hits, everyone shows up for the first week. We call that the casserole phase. Everyone brings food. But 6 months in, that's when the deep isolation sets in. Susan bridged that gap with consistency.
And then there's the smudging. I love this detail because it shows the diversity of her friend group. She has the conservative Christian prayer warriors on one hand, and then she has the witchy friends on the other.
Right. Her friend Amy comes over with burning sage and crystals to smudge the house, to clear the negative energy left behind by the deception.
That coming from her specific evangelical background, that's a massive jump. I mean, sage and crystals. That's usually a strict no-go zone for conservative Baptists.
It is, but Jen entirely embraces it, and this points to the expansion of her worldview that we talked about earlier. She realizes that care can come in many different forms. It symbolizes a widening of her world. She realizes she needs the traditional prayers and the sage. She needs the theology and the energy work. Ritual is deeply powerful for the human brain, regardless of the specific dogma attached to it. Allowing her friend to smudge the house gave her a renewed sense of agency over her physical space.
She also had to learn how to parent herself. Since her partner was gone and she was running the house alone, she developed this concept of morning Jen and night Jen.
This is a fantastic practical tool, specifically for people dealing with depression, grief, or executive dysfunction.
Explain that connection for us.
When you are grieving heavily, your executive function, which is the part of the brain that plans, organizes, and executes tasks, is severely impaired. Everything feels impossible. By splitting herself into night Jen and morning Jen, she essentially gamified her own self-care.
So night Jen does the dishes and sets the coffee pot so that morning Jen can wake up to a clean kitchen and fresh caffeine. And then morning Jen makes the bed so that day Jen feels orderly and capable.
It sounds trivial to people who haven't been through it, but it's actually a profound form of self-reparenting. It's a way of saying, I am worthy of care, even if I have to be the one to give it to myself. It breaks the cycle of self-neglect that very often accompanies deep grief. It establishes a relationship of trust with oneself.
Speaking of breaking cycles, let's talk about the physical rebuilding of her life. There are 3 major symbols in the latter half of the book: the porch, the Bronco, and the table. Let's start with the porch.
The porch is devastatingly symbolic. Before he left, her husband tore the front porch off the house. He started a renovation project that he never finished. So when he moved out, the house literally had a gaping hole in the front. It was a broken home in the most literal architectural sense.
And she couldn't fix it herself. She didn't have the skills. So her girlfriends, her handy women friends, came over with power tools and rebuilt it for her.
It's a reclamation of space. But notice the shift in agency here. She didn't wait for a man to come fix it. She didn't hire a contractor to make the problem disappear. Her community stepped in and built it with their own hands. It sends a powerful psychological message that the damage left behind by someone else doesn't have to be permanent, and you don't have to rely on the old systems to repair it.
And then the Bronco. I just love this part. Jen admits she is completely car blind. She says she can't tell a Honda from a Toyota. She's driven whatever invisible mom car she was handed her whole adult life.
Which is very typical of the good girl archetype, accepting what you're given without complaint. Passivity is viewed as a virtue in that template. But in the rebuild phase, she decides she needs a car that reflects who she is right now.
So she goes out and buys a 1975 matte black Ford Bronco. It's loud. It's a manual transmission. It smells like gasoline. It is the ultimate anti-mom car.
It represents pure autonomy. She chose it herself. And importantly, it requires a touch to start, just like her. It's old, it has a history, but it has moxie. It's a complete rejection of the invisible, seamless, accommodating life she was supposed to live. It's a car that demands to be seen and heard on the road. It is a loud extension of her new identity.
And finally, the table. This is the big aha moment for me in reading these sources. She's in the backyard of her house, and she decides to build a massive 28-seat dining table.
Think about the underlying logic there. She just lost her partner. Her immediate family has shrunk. The logical expected thing to do would be to downsize, to retreat, to build a smaller life because you have less family to accommodate.
But she does the exact opposite. She looks at this giant table and says, I will fill you.
That is a declaration of defiance against loneliness. It is the abundance mindset in action. She decides that instead of shrinking her life to fit her grief, she is going to expand her life to accommodate more love. She realizes that family isn't just who you are biologically related to or married to. Family is who you gather.
That perfectly leads us into the final section of our deep dive today, new understandings, the after. Because she's not just rebuilding furniture and buying vintage cars, she's rebuilding her entire worldview.
And her view of marriage itself. There's a very poignant reflection in the text on what would have been her 27th wedding anniversary.
Yeah, she refuses to regret the 26 years they had.
Yeah.
She actually lists the wins, the 5 kids, the good memories, her own personal growth.
This is so important because it actively avoids the sunk cost fallacy. We often think if a marriage ends, the whole thing was a waste of time. Complete failure. She reframes the concept of forever. In her culture, we are taught that a successful marriage is only one that ends in death. If it ends in divorce, it's a failure. Jen challenges that deeply held notion. She realizes that the forever she was promised isn't guaranteed by a single romantic relationship. It's the community around her. The friends who showed up with coffee and sage, the family that rallied to build a porch. That is the safety net. That is the actual forever.
And her parenting changed drastically, too. She talks about this thing she called the dad addendum. Her father sends her this text after seeing her totally crumble, basically admitting that he cried all the way home because he couldn't fix the pain for her.
That's an incredibly hard lesson for any parent. We want to be the fixers. We want to shield our kids. But her dad models the only thing that actually works in the face of profound trauma, which is witnessing. He essentially says, I can't make the sun shine again for you, but I am here. And Jen takes that realization and applies it directly to her own kids. She stops trying to manage their grief or manufacture a happy ending for them.
She even gives up on their grades. The section on COVID school is hilarious and so relatable. She's just like, D's get degrees. We are surviving right now.
It's a massive shifting of priorities. Survival and emotional connection over performance. She realizes that maintaining the relationship with her kids is infinitely more important than maintaining their GPA during a global pandemic and a family collapse. She even goes to what she calls me camp. She follows her kid to Maine and just stays nearby, not interfering, just to be close. It's all about presence, not perfection.
And finally, her faith, which is the bedrock of her entire public and private life. She was a pastor's wife. She literally built a church. And now she says she feels like a ghost in the sanctuary.
This is what the text describes as the sanctuary to the porch shift. She finds that the institutional church, with its rigid rules, its exclusions, its politics, just doesn't hold God for her anymore. Instead, she finds God in nature, in the ocean, in the eyes of her friends, at that massive 28-seat table in her backyard.
She writes about moving from holiness, which is entirely about separation and following rules, to goodness, which is about connection and unconditional love.
It's a complete move from a transactional faith, which says if I do X, God gives me Y, to a relational faith. She realizes she doesn't need the institutional gatekeepers anymore. She has direct access to the divine through the actual love she gives and receives every day.
So bringing it all home, we started with a dead rose, a symbol of shame, control, and fear. And we ended up with the matte black Bronco, a symbol of autonomy, moxie, and freedom.
It's the quintessential journey from a simple life based on rules to a true life based on integrity. And the cost was undeniably high. She lost the story she had built for 26 years, but she gained the truth.
I want to leave our listeners with this specific moment Jen had with her friend Shauna in New York City. They're sitting there drinking wine, and Jen is exhausted, feeling like a literal pile of broken shards on the floor. And Shauna looks right at her and says, "You are still exactly you. You're not broken."
That's the ultimate takeaway from all these sources. Trauma takes things away from you. It takes your plans, your financial security, your social status. But it doesn't take you, the core of who you are, the part of you that laughs, that loves, that drives the Bronco. That part is completely indestructible.
And here's a final thought to chew on as you go about your day. We so often think of rock bottom as a place where we die. It's the worst case scenario. It's the end. But Jen's deep dive suggests something entirely different. Rock bottom is solid ground. It's the only place where you can finally stop falling. And once you stop falling, you can start building something that is actually yours. Not the story you were handed by your culture, but the life you actively choose.
So the provocative question to ask yourself is this. If you were to look at your life today, right now, in this exact moment, are you living the story or are you living the truth?
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.